Hi everybody, you get me again. Sorry I don't have the most exciting PowerPoints. I'm going to try to go through this one just a little bit faster than the other one. The other one was about 30 minutes long, but we'll see. And ice keeps falling out of the refrigerator. That's really weird. Anyway, welcome back. This is Chapter 7, The Road to Revolution. A couple things I want you to keep in mind as we go through this PowerPoint. First of all, number one, the theme of American identity is rampant throughout this chapter, as well as the principle of politics, the principality of American identity. The colonists, in a small group of colonists, revolting because of basic political principle. And the other phrase I want you to keep in mind is reluctant revolutionaries. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. So I was just fooling around here. Hi, everybody. Anyway, let's move on and let's cut to the chase. So time frame here is 1763 to about 1775, right as the revolution breaks out. So overview for this one, number one, Britain was in debt, and according to a lot of the leaders in Parliament, they felt that the colonists needed to pay their fair share. And you know, in hindsight and researching this topic, this outbreak of revolution, I mean, you kind of look at it, and from the British point of view, the people in England were paying a lot more and pulling their weight for the war effort, and the colonists 3,000 miles away were not. So why? It's almost from their point of view, from leaders in Parliament, why were the colonists kind of being like the analogy I said to you before, those kind of bratty teenagers, and why were they revolting? So you know that they were in debt. They had more troops over in the colonies than before because of the war for protection, and they needed money to pay for the stationing of the troops in America. Number two, like we just said, who's going to shoulder that burden? The colonists. According to the British Parliament, it's time to buck up, to pay their fair share. The colonists' point of view, though, this is a total change in colonial policy and British policy toward the colonists, and that's something that, I mean, for years, no pun intended, had been brewing, and so we'll talk about that a little bit more. However, big idea again, this revolution was not inevitable. Could this have been avoided? Yes. Americans were reluctant revolutionaries. It wasn't like after the French and Indian War, we had a whole bunch of colonists running around yelling for freedom. Not even in their minds. They still considered themselves British subjects, wanted to remain part of England, the majority of the population. We had a very, very small part of the colonial population that actually wanted to revolt or had even talked about it. Even our first Continental Congress was not aiming for independence, revolution, nothing. They wanted to retain rights as Englishmen as they saw it, as they felt that they had always been part of. And with this change in colonial policy by the British, they just felt that their rights were being violated. This contract that they had agreed to back in 1607. That's why the charter at Jamestown, one of the stipulations was that all Englishmen would retain their rights, and that was the precedent that was set. All Englishmen would retain their rights as if they were living in England. So that's one idea I want you to just pound in your heads, get through, that colonists were not thinking revolt or revolution or independence in 1763. And like we said in the beginning too, just finally this clash over political principles. Colonists were contradictory in a lot of ways, but they kind of rode on their high horse and stood by their principles and would not relent. So let's dive into it and go on to the first topic. So deep roots of revolution. So from the very beginning, Europeans encountered a whole new world to make fresh. So in a broad sense, the American Revolution really began when the first colonists set foot on America by the mid-1700s. We've been talking about this for a while. Republicanism took root, meaning this idea that all citizens would work for the common good. We see it in John Smith and the way he took over the colony at Jamestown. If you don't work, you don't eat. Working for this common good, this virtue of citizenry, and with the colonies developing on their own without the British Crown, you know that all the colonies had their own colonial government, the different parts of the colonies had their own forms of government, that people are working for something more than themselves as an individual. All citizens are working for the common good. London, again, was 3,000 miles away. Sailing across the Atlantic, it took at least a month and a half to 2 months, sometimes 3 months, depending on how rough the seas were. So the colonists really did feel very far away from, far removed from Europe. They felt physically and spiritually separated. Colonists in America without influence from superiors felt that they were fundamentally different, more independent. They began to think of themselves as Americans on the cutting edge of British civilization. So they really felt proud of what they were doing. Also in England, in Parliament, in London, we had the Radical Whigs. And this group published a lot. The colonists read a lot by the Radical Whigs, but this group felt really threatened by power in the monarchy. Their statements were widely read in the colonies and newspapers. They also really pounded the idea into people's brains about the corruption by the crown, and they tried to expose a lot of those things. Life in the colonies was vastly different. People could, I mean, in a sense, from the beginning, pull themselves up by the bootstraps and make something of themselves. We see that with indentured servants, with the Scots-Irish coming over. There were no princes, no barons, no land ownership, no family name in many cases. You could own land. You could make something of yourself. This has always been part of the national identity of America. And great distance weakens authority greatly. I mean, 3,000 miles away. So, and all the other things that we've been talking about along the way, this idea of freedom of the press, freedom of religion in certain colonies, Roger Williams in Rhode Island, all of these seeds have slowly been planted. And it wasn't like citizens were like, oh, yay, we want a revolution. Not at all. They didn't, I mean, they realized things were going on, but they were British subjects. They're citizens of the crown. But underlying, you know, we've got all these things going on. Okay, so what's the problem here? One of the biggest things is economically the system of mercantilism and then colonial grievances. So a big picture here, Georgia is the only colony planted by the British. All the other colonies, either they were set up by royal companies, businessmen, who own land, proprietor colonies, religious purposes. They got different charters. The only one that was actually planted by the British was Georgia. And we learned James Oglethorpe had set it up for a couple different reasons, really to serve as a buffer. It was the big one between the Spanish and the French and the Americans, the British. So the system of mercantilism, what is it? So really what mercantilism is, it's a British theory that justified their control. A country's economic wealth could be measured by the amount of gold or silver in its treasury. To amass that gold and silver, a country had to export more than it imported in order to obtain a favorable balance of trade, to come out ahead more than what you're spending. Countries with colonies were at an advantage because the colonies could supply the mother country, the mama country, with raw materials, wealth, supplies, and then a market for selling the finished products back. So it's a win-win for the mama country, and it's still a win for the colonies as well, in a sense, in this case, because they're British subjects. They'd always, at least, families had been part of the British, under the British monarchy. They were British subjects. So for America, that meant giving Britain all the ships, stores, sailors, and trade that they needed and wanted. Also, they had to grow tobacco and sugar for England. The Brits would have otherwise had to have bought from different countries. So the South was especially favorable to Britain. Colonists, though, they kind of saw themselves as tenants in a way, and they resented that a little bit, like they were just kind of being used, exploited, which, at the end of the day is true. But the thing about the mercantilism and what we call the navigation laws in the 1650s. We had talked about these before under Charles II. He really tried to tighten up the laws early on. 1688, as the Glorious Revolution took place, and later on, different wars in England were distracting. We went through a period of salutary neglect. And so even though these laws were in place, some of the navigation laws include we could only trade with Great Britain. It had to be done on English ships and no others. Other laws stated that European goods consigned to America had to land first in England to pay the middlemen. There were also some products called enumerated goods that could only be shipped to England. Settlers were restricted in what they could manufacture at home. Beaver hats, for example, they could not trade. They could make beaver hats, though, for their own personal use. They also kept Americans in debt, or at least without a currency, I should say. Not really in debt, but without a currency. A lot of gold and silver had to be paid for goods coming from England, and there was a shortage of it in the colonies. And so different colonies began to print their own money, which depreciated in value, and pretty soon we had colonials actually bartering goods with each other. And that meant that, you know, the more goods that you could import from the mama country, from Britain, the better for the mama country, because they're getting rid of these goods and they're paying for them. But then as currency in the colonies, these things were traded. So they kind of kept the colonies at a disadvantage there. Colonists also resented the fact that colonial laws could be voided by what they called a Privy Council in Parliament. They used this sparingly, but still the colonists kind of didn't like the fact that they could use it at all. So, for example, if there's some sort of colonial law passed in Jamestown in that colony, this Privy Council could deem it basically unconstitutional according to their constitution. So there's pluses and minuses with mercantilism, so we'll take a look at the goods. So by 1763, most navigation laws, like we said, were not strictly enforced. There's smuggling, bribing. One of the most famous smugglers was the John Hancock family. John Hancock, the guy with the big signature in the Declaration of Independence. He had amassed a fortune through smuggling. Britain existed for the benefit of the colonies. The colonists benefited from protection. So Britain had the strongest navy army in the world at the time, and the colonists didn't have to pay for it. They got free protection. Tobacco planters, even though they couldn't ship anywhere else to Britain, really had a monopoly in the market. And because of salutary neglect, the colonists had a good opportunity for self-government. Basically, the Americans had it made. So even repressive laws weren't enforced much, and the average American benefited much, much more than the average Englishman. Like we said, they weren't even paying even as high taxes as they were in England for certain wars and for the French Indian War. So the mistakes that occurred later on down the road didn't occur out of malice, at least until the Revolution. France and Spain were also embracing mercantilism and actually enforced it even more strictly than the British on the colonies. So Americans really had it made. Some of the negative aspects of mercantilism, 1763 is when the British colonial policy began to change, and they began to enforce the laws a little bit more. So disadvantages, Americans couldn't buy, sell, ship, or manufacture under their most favorable conditions. They did not have a say in that. The South was preferred over the North because they grew crops that England didn't want to buy from anywhere else. Virginia, which grew just tobacco, was at the mercy of British buyers. So when times were good, people are at work and planting, but when times were bad and the crops began to fail, a lot of planters were out of work. Many colonists felt that Britain was just milking her colonies for all they were worth. Theodore Roosevelt later said, "Revolution broke out because England failed to recognize an emerging nation when it saw one." But overall, at the end of the day, the colonists really did have it good. Okay, so the stamp tax uproar. So after the French and Indian War, Britain had huge debt, and though it had no intention of making the Americans pay it all off, it did feel that Americans should pay for at least one-third of the cost, since redcoats had been used for protection of the Americans. So Prime Minister George Grenville began to enforce the navigation laws strictly after 1763. Now, coupled with the Proclamation Act of 1763, now this in 1763, then the Sugar Act of 1764 was passed, and so there was an extra tax on sugar. Then the Quartering Act of 1765 was passed, so the colonies had to provide some sort of shelter and provide food for the British troops that were over there. The stamp tax, though, is what really upset a lot of colonials. This is not a stamp that we're talking about that goes on mail. It's a stamp that shows approval that a tax was paid on all paper goods. There are hundreds of paper items that were taxed, and so if you paid this tax, you got a stamp on whatever sheet of paper, showed that you had made this payment. So again, the idea there was that Americans were going to pay their fair share. If you were caught not doing it or just defied the law, you were then put into what was called an admiralty court. Juries were not allowed, and you were assumed guilty. You had to prove that you were innocent. So very hard to get that overturned. A lot of colonists began to question, like, why were the troops still there in the first place? So some colonists began to be a little leery of that. And the biggest thing that we always hear about is no taxation without representation. So a minority of colonists really were irked at the idea of being taxed without representation in Parliament. And Britain, the colonists recognized that overall, the big picture, Britain should be in charge of who they're, who going to trade with, the economy in general. Colonists were good with that. They didn't believe that Britain should be able to tax individual Americans within the colonies. They felt that that was their right to do that within the colony themselves. So, number one, again, the seeds of independence were there, already established their colonial governments, but also this idea that they're not being represented. However, if they were physically represented in Parliament, it's a catch-22, they would lose this battle every time because they would be outvoted every time. They have such a small minority. So they didn't want someone actually there in Parliament. It was just the principle of the thing, the idea that nobody was there representing them. But the British Prime Minister Grenville said, you are virtually represented. Everyone in the British Empire is virtually represented. You're always in our hearts and minds as British subjects, so you're therefore represented by us. We want what's good for you. They thought that was, like what your book said, hogwash. Virtual representation is hogwash. Sovereign power of government could not be divided. So, again, they felt that the individual colonies had the rights, over individual Americans at that time. In 1765, the Stamp Act Congress was called. 27 delegates from 9 different colonies. And guess who wasn't present? Guess who didn't send delegates? Georgia. They agreed also that they would not import, they would do a boycott against British goods, not import them. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty really took the law in their own hands. Anyone who agreed to buy British goods or didn't follow the boycott were tarred and feathered and made, humiliated in public. Stamp agents were forced to resign. If you were appointed by the Crown to administer those stamps, you were pretty much run out of town. So really, at the end of the day, the colonists did suffer. Many people were out of work. Merchants, shippers, etc. suffered because trade kind of came to a standstill. So in 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but as a little dig, they passed the Declaratory Act, which took its place. And basically, it was Parliament saying, screw you guys, we are still in charge of you. Parliament has the right to bind the colonies in any case. So it doesn't matter, as far as taxation, virtual representation is the law of the land. We make the big decisions. So it was just kind of a big screw you guys by the Parliament. All right. Charles, Champagne Charlie, who could deliver a speech drunk in Parliament like you've never seen. or the nickname Champagne Charlie, he proposed the Townshend Act. So who was this guy? He was basically the finance minister within Parliament, and he came up with this idea that, hey, let's kind of pull a fast one on the colonists. He proposed a light import duty on items such as glass, white lead, paper, paint, and tea. This was an indirect custom tax. So what that meant is that the citizens aren't paying this tax directly. It's being paid at the ports, but the people who then sell, the merchants who sell these goods, would then have to raise their prices on these things. So indirectly, the colonists are paying for this tax, but they're not paying for the tax right there when they buy the item. So that's an indirect tax. So what really irked a lot of the colonists is that this indirect custom tax was earmarked to pay royal governors and judges. Now, if you remember way back a couple chapters ago, how the colonists kept a lot of their judges in check was they set their pay scale, that if they felt that the judges or the royal governors weren't doing their job, they wouldn't get paid. So now that was being taken away by the British Crown. So again, a change in policy. Non-importation agreements, again, a lot of colonists called for. They weren't as effective because this tax was not direct and it really wasn't affecting people directly. So people weren't as invested in the non-importation agreements. And smugglers, again, I mean, they increased their activity and they were making money. So it was kind of not really effective over the Townshend Acts. More troops were sent over because the Crown knew that some of the colonists, especially in Boston, were getting a little restless. So they sent a couple more regiments of troops over just to kind of keep an eye, especially in Boston. So on March 5th, 1770, so this is 7 years after the French and Indian War had ended, there was a crowd of about 60 townspeople in Boston. They were harassing about 10 British soldiers, and these soldiers were keeping guard basically outside Customs House, where they keep some of the money. And one fellow got hit in the head, another got hit by a club without orders but heavily provoked. The troops opened fire, wounding or killing 11 innocent citizens, including Crispus Attucks, a black former slave and the leader of the mob in the Boston Massacre. So Attucks became a symbol of freedom, from slave to freeman to martyr who stood up for Britain for liberty. And only 2 redcoats were prosecuted. John Adams actually represented them in court. Pictured here, we have Sam Adams, so not to be confused with John Adams. All right, so 1770, Lord North and Parliament repealed the Townshend duties, except with tea. So that ticked off, again, a lot of colonists. And so the colonies were like, okay, especially in Boston, we're going to keep everybody informed of what's going on here, because really, what is going on here? So Samuel Adams organized, this is Samuel Adams, not really a good politician. He was cousin of John Adams. He was known to, I guess, have, shake a lot. Not that it has anything to do with politics, but just wasn't quite the orator that John Adams was. Had a hot temper, things like that. So he wasn't a great politician per se. Good brewmaker, I guess. But anyway, one of the things he is noted for is organizing the committees of correspondence in Boston in 1772. And what this was meant to do is, within the city of Boston and within the surrounding colonies, trying to get the word out, like what the British government is actually doing. The next step into all of this was intercolonial committees of correspondence. So it kind of blows our mind. I mean, we get information so quickly now, I mean, with a text boom. But you have to think, back in the day, it would take weeks, months to get information from colony to colony. So the next step in this whole process was intercolonial committees of correspondence that were set up. 1773, not a whole lot happening. So we had, 3 years go by, people going along with the tea tax. I mean, they're actually getting tea pretty cheaply as compared to people in London. So like I said, the colonies really did have it made. But here's a problem. 1773, the British East India Company is about to go under. They're going bankrupt. And so to save face, the British Crown grants the British East India Company control of all American tea business. And so they had a lot of ships filled with tea en route to the colonies. Many thought that this was a trick, that they were really trying to slip a fast one past the colonists, like to get them to like the tax that was continuing on tea. And so Americans, yeah, with the bait of cheaper tea, paying this tax, so they got all riled up. And at the end of the day, none of the tea was ever unloaded from the company. But on December 16th, 1773, some whites, led by Samuel Adams, disguised themselves as Indians, I guess a symbol of savagery and intimidation, even while people watched, but opened 342 chests and dumped the tea into the ocean in this Boston Tea Party. Britain did lose thousands of dollars because of this. They were not happy. People in Annapolis did the same. We don't hear much about that, but they burnt ships to water level. Reaction was varied from approval to outrage to disapproval, as you can imagine how people talk throughout the colonies. Edmund Burke declared, "To tax and to please, no more than to love and be wise, is not given to men." All right, so Parliament reacts, and this is where things went awry, and this whole situation probably could have been avoided. This was not inevitable, but it just kept going back and forth and escalating. So 1774, Parliament passes a series of acts to chastise particularly Boston. First, the Boston Port Act. They closed the harbor. Intolerable Acts was the name adopted by the colonists, and until they paid the British Crown back, the port would not be open. So that's going to hurt a lot of merchants. Their chartered rights were taken away. So the Crown is going to take direct control of Boston. There are restrictions on town meetings. Troops who committed a crime were actually sent to Britain for trial, so most likely they're innocent over there. And then they made a stricter quartering act just for Boston. So residents of Boston actually had to take troops into their homes, their private homes, and feed and give them shelter. So that's why in our Constitution today, we have strictly a provision about quartering troops in private homes. At the same time, I don't know what Parliament was thinking, they passed what was called the Quebec Act. So after the French and Indian War, we've got these French Catholics under now the British Crown. What are they to do with them? They basically, in the Quebec Act, gave these French citizens autonomy. They could practice their Catholicism openly and freely, and they were given all these rights, degree of autonomy, and the colonists thought, well, why are they being treated like this? They're the enemy, and we're Englishmen, and we're getting the raw end of the deal. So that irked a lot of colonists, but they weren't passed together in one package. They just happened to be passed at the same time. Okay, so now we're coming upon not so good times, 1774, 1775. The First Continental Congress meets in 1774 in Philadelphia from September 5th to October 26th. And this really wasn't a Congress per se, it was really just a discussion. It was really just a convention to discuss what's going on, kind of get on the same page. While not wanting independence yet, it did come up with a list of grievances, which were, you guessed it, ignored in Parliament when they sent those over. They had, within that 7-week deliberation, like I said, the Declaration of Rights. The association was formed, and this called for a complete boycott of British goods, and this was actually followed through. Again, Sons and Daughters of Liberty made sure that it was followed through. No call for independence. And if their grievances weren't met by Parliament, they agreed that they would meet again in May of 1775. Well, Parliament did reject the terms, but things happened before they could meet. So in April of 1775, Lexington and Concord, shot heard around the world. British troops were ordered to march to Lexington. They had heard about weapons that were being stored in that town. We'll talk about Paul Revere and his famous midnight ride, the Longsworth home. But we'll talk about that in class. But they warned that the British were coming. They were able to move the weapons in time and things like that. But anyway, as they marched to Concord, so firing did happen in Lexington Green. A little skirmish happened. The colonials were defeated. As the troops marched to Concord, they didn't find the weapons that they were looking for. They had hid them. But anyway, on the march back to Boston is when the colonists took control of the situation, and they kind of mowed down the, not mowed, they mowed down the British troops that were headed back to Boston. So it was really a victory for the colonials. But anyway, so we've got bloodshed in 1775. So heading into this conflict, American pluses and minuses. So we have the pluses: outstanding leadership, George Washington, Ben Franklin, diplomatic, European officers that would come over and start training our colonial troops. We are on the defensive fighting, so we can fight as long as we are able to, because we're not going on the offensive. We're not the ones provoking the war. We're sitting back and playing defense. We're self-sustaining. We've got a lot of farms. We can grow food and things like that. We've always, the colonists have been there a while. They know the land. They know how to work it. They can figure it out. We have something worth fighting for. Moral advantage. They believe in this principle. No taxation without representation. We have our liberties, freedoms, all of it. But badly organized, lacking in unity. And you saw that with the Albany Congress back in the French and Indian War. Even Continental Congress is disorganized. There's sectional jealousy. I mean, we've got colonies that are jealous of each other. So we're really lacking this sense of oneness. Economic difficulties. Continental paper money is worthless. There's inflation. We can't get enough supplies. We can't get money. We're highly disorganized, as you can imagine, because we've always been under the protection of the mama country of England. We never had to worry about this kind of stuff. So a thin line of heroes in the next section. So like I said before, our military supplies are scarce. We don't have the money to purchase. We relied on France when Benjamin Franklin secured our friendship with France. France is chomping at the bit to get back at Britain. But Valley Forge, the winter of 1776, 1777 is going to be an example of the lack of resources. Where men were without shoes, they were eating their shoes, they were so hungry. They were dying of smallpox disease. Militiamen were numerous but highly unreliable. They're not trained. Deadly smallpox outbreaks. We did have what were called camp followers. These were women who would cook so for troops in return for rations and money from, the government. German Baron von Steuben whipped many soldiers into shape, so we had to rely on foreign aid there. Blacks also fought and died for the cause, and on the British side as well. On the British side, they were promised their freedom, so a lot did go to the British side. And the British government really did follow through with their promise on that. American profiteers, so people who badly undermined the cause, people who were in it for themselves, didn't care one way or the other, but wanted to make profit off of this war. So they would jack up the prices on certain items. The British could clearly pay for it. The Americans couldn't. So that undermined the cause. But only a select minority, this is what's truly fascinating, a select minority threw themselves toward this cause of independence with selfish devotion. And in the end, they're the ones who saw it through and gained independence for the colonies. So definitely